Questions. Obviously, we're behind schedule. I was hoping to leave some time for your all's questions, and I'll still try to do that if the schedule allows. So starting to my left, we have Matt Schruers, who's the Vice President of Law and Policy at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. We have George York. Thank you. George York, the Senior Vice President of International Policy at the Recording Industry Association of America, coming off a big night with the Grammys. We have Damien Levie, who's the Head of Trade and Agriculture for the Embassy of the European Union. And then finally, at the end, Robb Tanner, who's the Director for Digital Trade at the U.S. Trade Representative. So thank them all for taking the time to come today and speak with us. I want to hit on several topics. And perhaps makes the most sense, though, to start with NAFTA, since the latest round of negotiations have wrapped up in Montreal. We'll start at the end, if we could, with Robert, which is, when it comes to NAFTA, what can you tell us about the state of digital trade and e-commerce provisions, with NAFTA and how those stand as far as the negotiations are concerned?
Sure, thanks, and welcome everybody. This is a much bigger turnout than we had in the other room, so I'm glad we moved. I think we are obviously in the middle of those negotiations, and so I think we've made good progress. Myself and my colleague Jonathan McHale are working on the telecommunications and digital trade chapters, and I think we're essentially still in the middle of trying to pursue a pretty robust and ambitious agenda. I think the last round was very positive, and definitely progress was made, but still some work to do.
Well, that's, I think, one of the themes we heard coming out of the latest rounds was more progress. Can you tell us at all how far apart the countries are on things like digital trade or e-commerce?
It's hard to get into specifics because you are in the middle of a negotiation. I think, by and large, there is a fairly common vision among the three countries in terms of trying to have a chapter on digital trade that is liberalizing and has strong commitments. And as well in telecommunications, the original NAFTA has a telecommunications chapter that was essentially negotiated before, not only before the internet, but before there was actually competition in telecommunications in most countries. So full sort of modernizing that and bringing that into sort of the way things work now. Again, I think the countries share, a pretty common vision, common interest in trying to achieve that.
Great, thank you. I want to come over to Matt, if I could, which is a couple of the issues that I know have been top of mind for many tech and telecom companies have been cross-border data flows. That's something that many want to see sort of enshrined in NAFTA and then used in future trade negotiations. What are your sort of expectations in terms of, where we might end up or where you might like to end up when it comes to cross-border data flows and some of these concerns around the movement of information over borders?
Sure. So, I think we'd like to end up in a place where there is a pretty consistent, reliable system under which businesses can do trade and services across the Atlantic. From the United States perspective, that's critical. We're increasingly a services exporter, and some of the fastest areas of growth in our services exports are actual digital services. And so we want to ensure that there's a market for that. And whether it's in North America or Europe, increasingly we also see that a lot of our trading partners have small and medium-sized enterprises that rely on those services that our companies, that our industries are exporting to reach international markets, to become a multinational, even though you're a small, medium-sized enterprise. So, there's the end game, I think, is there's consensus about where we want to be, that these services can be freely traded. There's something like $260 billion in trade at stake just in the transatlantic relationship. And I think similar numbers through North America. And so we're very hopeful and interested that we can establish some common rules of the road that will provide for U.S. businesses to access markets and for customers in those markets to utilize our services to serve their customers.
And do you see NAFTA as an opportunity to kind of set a standard that future trade agreements will be held against, both bilateral but also these multinational trade agreements?
Well, I think it's, I don't know that it's prudent to say we're just going to, this is going to be our one time and we're going to set a benchmark now. If you look, our understanding of what rules and frameworks we need in trade have grown over time. As Rob was pointing out, the telecoms chapter in NAFTA dates from the early 90s. When you think about when that text started coming together, it was probably in the late 80s. It certainly predates all the companies that I represent and most of the services that folks out in the room are typing away on and using right now. And so obviously we have a lot just to bring ourselves up to the current date to provide frameworks for the trade and services that we're conducting now. But it's also going to be a process of iteration and improvement over time. And so certainly what goes into NAFTA will be critical, but also we're going to have to recognize that this is an area that is going to develop over time, and we'll realize we need new disciplines and new priorities and protections as time passes.
Got it. But George, I'd like to come to you next, which is, and ask you, the creative industries sort of always have intellectual property and copyright top of mind, right? It's very fundamental to the businesses you represent. Where do you think, when it comes to IP and copyright in NAFTA particularly, we've often seen a more enforcement-driven approach, and some folks in tech particularly have sort of pushed back against that and wanted to see maybe more liberal rules. Where do you stand on that, and what do you expect might come out of these rounds of negotiations?
Thanks a lot. So look, we are extremely supportive, first of all, of the NAFTA modernization effort, and it's something we very much hope is successful. And I think consistent among all the speakers that you're going to hear today, we see a lot of real potential upside, both in terms of our industries that we represent, the nations who we work for, but also for sort of our respective job creation, trade competitiveness, and other aspects that contribute to our economic growth. So for our industry specifically, I would like to sort of start with a slightly different premise, which is we are very supportive of digital trade, a strong, inclusive digital trade policy from the United States, and obviously likewise from the European Union and from other key markets around the world. So there we share with respect to data flows, cross-border restrictions on services, digital trade product discrimination, tariffs on digital trade products. We're probably in the same place that many of the other people in the room are who are up to speed on some of these NAFTA trade disciplines. So there we're very supportive, and we see that as very important for creative sectors in the United States who rely heavily on copyright, but not to the exclusion of other critical disciplines. So we support Robb's efforts profoundly in most areas of the digital trade chapter. Likewise, in the intellectual property chapter, to your kind of specific question, obviously strong copyright is critical for us. It's what allows us to license our work to about 40 million tracks to about close to 400 digital platforms around the world. And that is, for us, what allows a digital trade policy, a digital trade economy to be both inclusive and sustainable, right? We wanted to promote legitimate trade in legitimate goods and services, or legitimate digital products, which a sound recording is. It's really critical that sound recordings are part of the digital trade outcome, and that would include streaming, right? The streaming economy in the United States is critical and growing and growing. Right now, close to 2/3 of the recording industry revenues are streaming, and it's really important for us. We've chatted with this to Robb, and this is true in many other markets globally, that streaming is critical not just for the recording industry, not just for the movie industry, but so many industries around the world. It's an emerging area where we have tremendous commonality between technology companies and music companies, which have become themselves technology companies. So the answer is IP is critical to us, as are other trade disciplines, which helps to reinforce legitimate digital trade.
And so when you think about what IP looks like in the new NAFTA in terms of modernization, because as you mentioned, when the first NAFTA was written, we didn't have music streaming. We didn't have all of the services that we have now. The industry looks very different. So in a NAFTA 2.0, what do we need to have in place? How do the rules, how does the language look different, compared to what we have in the first agreement?
It's a great question. So obviously, with the advent of digital trade and e-commerce, specific copyrights are going to be especially prevalent, as are additional protections that we've seen in many other trade agreements as well. So it's not a fundamental departure, but obviously the communication to the public right and the making available right, and apologies for the minutia on copyright. Matt will enjoy it, but I'm not sure everyone will. So those are critical technological protection measures, which are basically the encryptions and other securities that facilitate legitimate, secure digital trade, right? So that's how credit card transactions work. That's how the cloud works. You have to rely on these technological protection measures, which we also rely on in the movie industry, the video game industry, for us in the sound recording industry, to ensure that access to copyright protected content is protected. And all of this, of course, is happening in a manner that's consistent with U.S. law. For us, the bottom line has to be, and we all have to say this talking point, but the bottom line has to be that any provision in a trade agreement in NAFTA has to be consistent with U.S. law, and it has to also be applied in a manner consistent with its original intent. And so we'll have different views about what that means, but certainly that's a point of commonality between all of us.
Great. Well, Damien, we're going to talk quite a bit about European trade as well. But I do want to ask you a question on NAFTA because you're watching these NAFTA negotiations as a non-participant. What have you gleaned about sort of the Trump administration's policy and policy priorities and approach to trade negotiations from watching these talks from the outside?
Well, first of all, we decided to renegotiate our free trade agreement with Mexico before the Trump administration decided to renegotiate NAFTA. So we fully understand you need to update and modernize all trade agreements. And if you want to know what we are negotiating with Mexico, it's all public. So you go on the website of the Commission, you go under Digitrade and Transparency, and all the texts are available, including on e-commerce, IPR, and all that. So you can know precisely what we are striving, and it's actually very modern, it's up to date. In a number of areas, we ask for more. We are more ambitious. In some areas, we're still not able to ask for more on data flows, for example. I'll come back to that later if you wish. But so I think, one, it's only normal you modernize the trade agreement. Two, I'd like to remind the people that the EU is in the top 3 seller and buyer of goods and services of any of the NAFTA countries. And we are the #1 foreign investor in the United States, and #1 or #2 in Canada and Mexico. So we're not directly involved, but we have a huge stake, and our companies have a huge stake. So anything that can improve the integration of the North American market is good for our companies as well. In terms of the policy areas, we'll be watching, what they renegotiate, and we'll look at that. And if Canada and Mexico agree to what the United States is asking, well, we'll take stock of that. In the meantime, we have our agreement with Canada, which just entered into force last September, and we hope to conclude with Mexico very soon, at least a political deal, and then we'll see.
And so you maybe touched on this a bit, but do you feel that the negotiations with NAFTA sort of lack a transparency or a visibility for those on the outside looking in? And a negotiator might say, well, you don't show your hand in a negotiation, right? But what do you make of that question?
Listen, I mean, I respect the policy of the United States government. I would simply say that we've taken, and Miriam Cepillo here remembers when she was deputy USTR, also in charge of TTIP, we decided to publish our own texts, not in market access, which is really the area where, from our perspective, you need to keep your cards very close to your chests, which tariff line you're going to give, which government entities you're going to give in government procurement, and in services the same. But apart from that, trade agreements cover many areas which are of interest for citizens in your everyday life, and they are concerned. We decided to be much more transparent in our trade negotiations. And so you can look on the web and compare what we are trying to do in EU Indonesia, EU Mexico, which is the same, what we've done in EU Japan or in EU Vietnam, and what we've done in the past in EU Singapore, EU Canada, or EU Korea, if you want. So you can compare, and you can see the evolution. We think it's necessary for legitimacy of public policy, of trade policy, in the European Union, where this was questioned, and people say, oh, these deals are negotiated in private. We don't trust these negotiators. So now we decided to publish the text and to be much more transparent on the outcomes of every negotiating round.
And Rob, I'd love to get kind of your reaction to that idea and question of, how much transparency is good and necessary, given that this is the government negotiating on behalf of the American people, versus a certain degree of sort of secrecy, as you're trying to get the best deal possible, so to speak.
Yeah, and I certainly appreciate Damien's, mentioning that there are different systems, and he respects our system. I think likewise, I mean, it's countries can take different approaches to this. I think the U.S. is quite transparent in the sense that we do work with the Congressional Trade Promotional Authority. We put out fairly detailed objectives in terms of what we're trying to achieve, which I think is very clear in terms of what the U.S. is trying to accomplish. And I think that is the balance, which is to say you need the ability to negotiate with your partners language that maximizes what everybody wants. I think we are guided by those objectives, and the process that we have in terms of leading into any negotiation also relies pretty extensively on both public comment proceeding, but also very extensive consultation process. Some of that is with cleared advisors, but certainly there is the opportunity for the public to talk to USTR, and that I think is sort of the way we ensure both transparency, but also make sure that we are responsive to what the public is seeking for us to do in NAFTA. And I guess just to follow up on some of the other comments, I mean, I appreciate George's comments as well. I think that is certainly important. The digital trade chapter encompasses a number of disciplines that we're proposing that I think are of great benefit, not just to what you would think of as technology companies, but also content sort of owners and companies that are interested in working with content owners. But frankly, also, it's important to lots and lots of companies and lots of sectors. So I think most of the folks here probably fully appreciate that. When you talk about ensuring essentially open access to markets for cloud computing services and sort of cloud computing functionality, so we pursue trade commitments around data flows and against localization requirements. That's as important to an insurance company as to John Deere, as to car companies, as it is to George's companies and Matt's trade association. And so, there is a lot of input that goes into this, but the ideas, the concepts we're pursuing in digital trade have a pretty broad impact.
Well, one of those sort of provisions that has a broad impact I wanted to talk about specifically is sort of intermediary liability, and sort of what in the U.S. we have Section 230 of CDA. I know that's something that many in tech consider to be sort of sacred scripture of the internet, a foundational principle that is constantly under siege, depending on who you talk to. So for George and for Matt, first I'd love to get kind of your take on, do you want to see Section 230 like or Section 230 language exact in NAFTA? And I guess, why not? And do you think that's realistic?
Sure. So the question here, just trying to step away from the legalese of Section 230, is whether we want our trading partners to adopt the sort of intermediary protection framework that the United States did in the late 90s that has been one of the cornerstones of the internet economic success that we've seen. And you could kind of look at that cynically. And in fact, I've seen some folks say, well, if other countries want to shoot their internet economy in the foot, why should we stop them? But that's precisely the wrong way to think about it because of the shared interest that we have that I was describing before. If you look across major internet firms, increasingly 6 or 7 out of 10 of their customers are overseas. These are huge exporters of the United States. They contribute positively, immensely to our trade balance. So we want to provide new markets into which they can provide their services. And as I was saying before, they're increasingly inputs into a lot of businesses that then use internet services to export. So it's a win-win. There's a shared interest in solving this problem. And in the scope of U.S. law, we're always, I think as everyone says, we're always very conscious to try and promote the U.S. law abroad, but there's often parts of U.S. law that have been left behind, and this is one very critical example. And so we increasingly see in foreign markets a sort of a shoot the messenger approach, where if somebody does something bad online, it may be harder to find the bad actor, and so instead governments will choose to penalize the intermediaries who are providing the service, and that makes a very difficult market to do business in. So it's an impediment to market access, and similarly, it then denies critical inputs to the local businesses that might want to use those services. So we want to get to a place where businesses can provide services into a market without being subjected to liability for misconduct to users. And it's important to remember that 230 is a good Samaritan law, and the idea is that by limiting intermediaries' liability, they actually have much more flexibility to go out and police content. Right now there's in some markets there's a fear if you catch 99 instances of misconduct but miss the 100th, you'll be blamed for having looked at all the others, and it creates this perverse disincentive to stick your head in the sand and don't look at all. A 230-like approach that has a Good Samaritan regime would allow intermediaries to try and police, build tools, build systems to prevent misconduct on platforms, and thereby enter markets and provide these services to customers that we do business with. And it was a critical success here in the United States, I think, as you pointed out, and increasingly that's important in the markets overseas that U.S. services are trying to do business in.
Well, if I could play just quick devil's advocate and ask a follow-up on that, there's the argument that because it gives this leeway, that companies therefore have the ability to be selective about what they enforce and sort of when they enforce it. And so I guess my question is, if I'm a foreign government, do I give that much leeway to, a U.S. tech corporation? And does that create problems for me potentially down the road?
Well, I think you characterize it in a very accurate way. There's often, I think, very much a sense of why should we provide protections to these foreign companies, right, who are doing business here. And as I explained, I think that's totally the wrong approach, right? That it's ultimately, one, you're suppressing your own domestic market from developing, but you're also denying your own customers the benefits of those services because they're going to move to invest in markets where the liability regime is one that's more manageable. But from a policy standpoint, I think it's also important to recognize that as businesses grow, they want to be a clean, well-lit place, and so larger businesses can invest more and more resources in policing content, developing services to protect against misuse. But that's going to scale, right? A garage startup isn't going to be able to develop a $50 million content moderation system, which, in fact, the vast majority of larger services have done this. Right? So a Good Samaritan framework provides a certain amount of flexibility for companies' solutions to grow as they grow while still providing the services to customers abroad.
Well, look, I very much agree with Matt's point on the importance of responsibility online and different incentives for achieving that. Certainly responsibility, a responsible internet is critical, as we've seen in so much of what's in the news today, in virtually every respect. I think, again, my thoughts on this issue will be similar to those with respect to the DMCA issues, though that's the copyright safe harbor in the IP chapter as opposed to the non-copyright safe harbor potentially in the digital trade chapter in NAFTA. And so firstly, I would say the first critical tenets of any provision in a trade agreement must again be that it is fully reflective and consistent of our law. And so the challenge of any trade agreement, and for all those who have been involved in that process, it's difficult to get it right. How much should be there? How much can you put in a trade agreement language that has to be in U.S. law, but how much of that U.S. law, which can go on for pages and have court decisions and a whole jurisprudence around it, it becomes complicated. It's a complicated exercise. So obviously, prudence is there with respect to the drafting of the provision that it must be consistent with that U.S. law. And obviously, we would always want to be sure, and we've seen versions of the language in the TISA negotiations, for example, where we have some questions about consistency with law. And then second of all, again, it must be applied in a manner consistent with the intent, right? And there's a lot of discussions right now in Congress, as Congress is currently actively engaged in reviewing this law with respect to a particular issue, very much a critical human rights issue, where Congress is actively engaged in reviewing and potentially amending this law. And so there is a prudential question about the engaging in a trade negotiation, given the timing of legislative processes and the timing of trade negotiations. And again, we're very hopeful about the NAFTA modernization effort, where one may be inconsistent with the other. And I think given that, typically in trade agreements, there's been a I would say a certain amount of prudence that's involved in terms of negotiating trade provisions where U.S. law that those provisions are based on is actively being considered for amendment.
And so, Rob, to sort of close out our NAFTA conversation, when it comes to sort of this intermediary liability, which is a mouthful question, and sort of these Section 230-like provisions, how committed is the U.S. to either the current, Section 230 language or to getting that principle embedded in a modernized NAFTA?
We're done with NAFTA after this?
Yeah. we're going to Europe. I don't know if that's less or more complicated.
Well, look, I mean, I think, it's difficult for me to get into the details being in the middle of this project, but we are pursuing trade provisions that would be consistent with U.S. law. And so I certainly wouldn't disagree with any of the points that George and Matt made. As with all of the provisions that we negotiate that affect services, we ensure that there is sufficient flexibility that we can address public policy goals. So there is a devil in the details, but that is certainly something we're pursuing.
Excellent. Well, now I do want to make my way across the pond and talk Europe if we could. And again, we'll try to leave time for questions, so have those in mind. If not, feel free to ask the panelists afterward if they're around and willing. But so I want to start off, and Damien, I'll start off with you. I'd like to read a quote from President Trump, who was speaking with Piers Morgan about trade with the European Union. This was on Sunday. He said, quote, "I've had a lot of problems with the European Union, and it may morph into something very big from that standpoint, from a trade standpoint. We cannot get our product in. It's very, very tough. And yet they send their products to us, no taxes, very little taxes. It's very unfair," end quote. So I want to start with you getting sort of your, I guess, either response to that quote specifically or the idea more broadly of a disparity and an unfair arrangement between the U.S. and the EU when it comes to trade, and to the extent it exists with digital trade specifically.
Thank you. When the president was in Davos, he delivered, I think, a very interesting speech. And if you read the part on trade, we probably would agree with everything he said. And so I think we prefer to focus on that pronouncement, if I can say. Now, his interview with ITV is a British channel and probably aimed at the British audience. So that's how I read some of his comments also on Brexit, which were not for an EU audience or EU 27. On trade, the tariffs of the United States and the tariffs of the European Union are roughly the same, slightly higher here, slightly higher there. They are the result of long-standing agreements, which we fought very hard for in the US as well. And so I think it's the result of a negotiation. And we, for the moment, export more than the US does for a number of reasons, I guess. We don't think trade is a zero-sum game. We think it's win-win. And there are areas where we have higher tariffs, areas here where the tariffs are higher. Take mini trucks, light commercial vehicles. The tariff is here 25%. It's about 10% in Europe. You'll find tariffs on our side where the tariffs are higher for beef. And in a trade negotiation, you negotiate concessions. And so you lower your tariffs there, I lower my tariffs there, and you come to a lower outcome, which is good for both. And so I'd say that's the whole idea of negotiations. It's win-win. It cannot be I win, you lose in a negotiation. That's how we look at international trade agreements. And in digital trade, I think the United States is a big exporter of a number of services. We export some other services. We're actually the largest exporter of services worldwide. And so we are very much engaged in trade negotiations worldwide with more than 10 countries, actually 15 if you add Mercosur as 4 countries. And so we want to promote our exports and make sure our companies have a higher share of a growing market. 95% of future world growth is outside Europe. And so we want to make sure our companies have a bigger share of that growing market in a way.
And for Rob, then, are there specifically again to digital, given that that's the focus of our panel discussion today, are there areas of trade currently with Europe around digital or policies around digital trade that USTR might view as sort of unfair or needing review to be more balanced?
I think in general, we're pursuing NAFTA. We're looking at other bilateral discussions. Part of that is assessing the relationship with the EU. I think our overall objective in digital trade as others is a fair and equitable trade. And so nothing that I would flag as specific. It is sort of part of a process of evaluation. We do pay a lot of attention to Europe. It is a big market, and there are a number of things that Europe is engaged in terms of internal reforms that we are very interested in and follow, both because in a lot of cases we think it's very good in terms of policy changes, but also to make sure that it happens in a way that facilitates trade between Europe and the outside. So that's basically our view of Europe right now.
If I can add, because you may not know this, because on Thursday, I believe, we have an annual meeting of the Information Society Dialogue. So US government officials and European Commission officials will be meeting, discussing the state of play of the digital single market, the net neutrality debate here, the copyright reform debate on our side, and some further topics. So actually we meet every year. And if you go back to the past, USTR and the Commission agreed on ICT principles. You remember? 2011, if I recall. So those were kind of common principles we were trying to push or trying to make sure other countries, third countries, would agree. For example, that a telecom regulatory agency should be independent, just to give you one example, or a number of other things. So we've been working on ICT issues and data flows, e-commerce, for a very long time, actually. And so TTIP is where it is. We are both focusing on other issues, but we're very much pursuing similar goals, I would say, for the moment. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask toward the end of the conversation, but I'll ask it now since you brought it up, which is what are the prospects for a revival of more direct trade talks between the European Union and the U.S.? Obviously, both are focused on other things at the moment, but I think there are many who sort of see opportunities to revisit those conversations that have maybe lapsed a bit.
I think I would say we're certainly evaluating it, and I think beyond that, it's difficult for me to say. Maybe Damien has more clarity on his views.
No, I think in any event, you would need to have a high-level conversation whether it's worth relaunching, and part of the conversation would be what's the purpose of trade agreements? Is it to rebalance trade deficits? Then we are not interested. Is it to create win-win solutions for both sides? Then we are interested. But if it's just focused on trade deficits, I would be very surprised if anyone in Europe would say, yeah, let's resume TTIP because we want to make sure we manage trade and we lower deficit or increase the surplus. I don't think that would be the approach followed in Brussels, but I'm only expressing my own personal views here.
I want to add one thing, too, which is not the bilateral discussion, but at the WTO, at the last ministerial in Buenos Aires, the EU and the U.S. were among a number of countries that supported the essentially discussion on e-commerce. Yes. And so in terms of what we've been talking about and many of these issues, we certainly hope that is a forum where we'll be able to work with the EU in moving forward on that.
Is there the potential to work on more specific niche issues like an e-commerce or other digital trade, sort of move the ball on those, so to speak, as opposed to doing a wholesale kind of trade talk?
Well, absolutely. There's the opportunity to have those discussions around e-commerce at the WTO. I think we're all actually quite looking forward to rolling up sleeves on that. Where that will go, it's a little early to say. It's January. It's been about less than a month, but I do expect that we will meet and we'll have substantive talks this year on that.
Great. Well, I want to come back to our industry representatives over here. And so for Matt and George, when you look at Europe, which is a big market for the companies that you work with and work for, but also, has some perils and some open questions, particularly around things like privacy and sort of more protectionist ideas that have been floated in certain parts of Europe. What stands out to you right now as sort of the biggest concern and then potentially biggest opportunity for your respective companies? We'll start with George, if we
Great. I think you've put it exactly right, of a market of tremendous opportunity, but also tremendous, not just potential, but tremendous actual to date, right? So we see in Europe, in many ways, in key member states and at the European Commission and European Union level, a correlation between strong IP protection, both that's copyright, but that's very much across the board, and then the importance of digital trade, right? And we see a correlation between the two. And obviously it's a sophisticated regime, it's a unique regime reflecting the European assessment of these critical issues. But digital trade, the key driver of digital trade for the U.S. exports and surplus is intellectual property rights licensing, right? So in last year, 80 billion in surplus. It's the second largest category of total digital services surplus in the United States were from IP licensing. So that's patents, that's copyright, that's audiovisual, that's movies and music, and other things. So we see that as driving. So you have this IP licensing second only to travel and tourism services. So second largest exports out of the United States of digital services trade at 125 billion, right? And we see that a lot of that going to the European Union, where we have a surplus in these specific areas, in part because they do afford these strong protections. We're also quite supportive of the European Commission's proposals with respect to their own domestic law on the EU Copyright Directive. So we see tremendous both actual and potential there. Likewise, I think one issue that that Damien and I were chatting about before the discussion started was the European GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. There's some concern as an unintended consequence, perhaps, of the implementation of that regulation, which has been longstanding, that it may impair access to registrant data, right, that has long been public, which has been used for legitimate public policy purposes of law enforcement, cybersecurity, for cybersecurity personnel, and then also by rights holders. ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Names and Numbers, I've forgotten something.
Sign names and numbers.
Yeah, is currently working on a policy about compliance with the GDPR, and we're quite tracking quite closely how that will evolve. And I think there's actually a lot of common ground between many stakeholder communities in the United States about where that should come out. So we're quite hopeful that the European Union will be able to have some kind of clarification about how the GDPR would be applied with respect to this who is data, registrant data, in a specific way.
So, yeah, I guess continuing the theme, there's a lot of opportunity, as I was saying before. Europe is a very large market for the export of digital services, but that is a win-win because those services are so frequently inputs into our trading partners' exports, which make their exports more competitive, right? And these are the kinds of make the pie bigger opportunities we want to look for. I think there, as George said, there's across industry, there are anxieties about the potential implementation ramifications of GDPR and the risk of unintended consequences, particularly for, I think, again, smaller firms that may not have the capacity or even the awareness to understand what kinds of compliance they need to do. And insofar as that compliance burden is a fixed cost, it falls the hardest on small businesses that don't have a large consumer base to distribute that cost across. So that's I think a situation that will require continued monitoring. Certainly, there's no doubt that privacy protection is a critical, important, and desirable regulatory objective. How one goes about it, of course, is I think what we're talking about here. I guess another issue. So I was referring to intermediary protections having been the cornerstone of the U.S. market. The European Union in 2000 in the e-commerce directive also has a horizontal intermediary, a sort of a don't don't shoot the messenger rule, which provides a certain amount of shared responsibility, limiting liability while also expecting intermediaries to try and maintain a clean, well-lit place. In the context of the DSM, I think there's been some suggestions, potential proposals that could, upset those protections. The DSM, I'm sorry, being the digital single market, which is also, I think, a very laudable objective, the idea of trying to create one unitary European market into which digital goods and services can be provided instead of a bunch of silos. Unifying that market would provide great value to European consumers, but also businesses that want to enter that market and know that there's one framework that they can comply with, one set of rules that they should understand. And so we're enthusiastic about the concept. Again, there's concerns about implementation. What if, in implementing this framework, the liability rules are upset in a way that, again, particularly smaller businesses can't comply with? It's going to, form an unintended barrier to market entry for those kinds of services.
Damien, do you want to respond to some of those concerns about the unintended consequences and also the idea of potentially, policies within either EU as a whole or parts of it that might seem like protectionism,
There are many questions in your question. First of
And
all,
limited time, I know.
yeah. First of all, on data privacy, I think it's important to realize that it's a constitutional law debate. It's a human right issue. It's not a regulatory objective. It's a human right issue. It's like your First Amendment debates. The reason for that is a number of, I would say even the majority of the European Union member states have been under totalitarian regimes. And when you are in a totalitarian regime, you want to protect your data privacy, your own personal data. And so once you've been freed of those regimes, there was not only the Eastern European countries under communist regimes, but also you had dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And so a lot of European Union citizens really want to consider their privacy, the privacy of their data, personal data, as a fundamental right. And so that explains, I think, the importance of the debate, also the reluctance to mingle these issues with trade agreements. Now, on the GDPR, the new rules that will enter into force on May 25th, a couple of points. One, it will lower the fixed costs because instead of having 28 different laws on privacy, on data privacy, you will have only one. So if you're an SME, you want to export your services, and today everybody does it. You put it on the web and anyone from the 28 and broader buys your stuff. So you don't need to hire data privacy lawyers from Germany, Italy, Spain, and so forth. If you're in France, you just hire one lawyer because there'll be one rule book, basically. There'll be one authority with which you check your rules and your protocols and whether that's okay. So there'll be a lot of benefits. And for the citizens as well, there'll be a lot of benefits from GDPR. I don't have time to go into that. Now, there are unintended consequences or unforeseen things when you adopt laws. I mean, that's the nature of a law. And the authorities and the experts are dealing with them. And I think if you have any new issue that you've discovered, or your members have discovered, tell it to the European Commission experts, raise it with the data protection authorities in the relevant member states, and they'll deal with it, they'll address it. I mean, obviously, we're moving from a situation with very low enforcement from the perspective of no fines or very little fines. There was enforcement, as we know, but there was, I think the pecuniary element of the deterrence wasn't much there. So now we're moving to a different world. I think the authorities are very much aware of that, and the Commission as well.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we do have a very hard stop at 2:25, so I'd like to thank our panelists for being here, and thank you all for coming. I hope this was informative. We apologize there were no audience questions, but again, thank you, and hopefully we're happy to chat afterward.
See you.